Knife Chats with Tobias now presents another Fixed Blade Friday night.
I'm going to talk a little bit about my Camillus Mark II fighting knife. What a lot of people like to call a K-bar, but I insist on calling a Camillus Mark II fighting knife. And well, one of the reasons I do that is because this is made by Camillus, not K-bar. And Camillus made more of these knives during World War II than K-bar did. The thing is well, the reason I'm bringing this up is partly because I carried it when I was in the Army, and partly because of a story my father told me. Now, before I get to the story my father told me, I want to shoot away to a little video on how I actually attached this to my gear when I was serving in the U.S. Army. So I would say 80 pounds ago or 40 years ago, and this was actually the suspenders I used with my LCE, the load carrying equipment I used in the Army. And notice West German Army flashlight, and over here is my Mark II fighting knife. And as you can tell, these are not normal suspenders that you would have seen even in the Vietnam War. These were even earlier than that. These are the suspenders that were used during the Korean War. I had them since my ROTC days, and I really just liked the way my knife would carry on these. And so when I joined my unit, first of the 54th Infantry in Bamberg, Germany, I said, what's the worst they can do is tell me I can't wear them. So I put them on, and no one said anything, and so I just continued to wear them. Then when I went to HHC 3rd Brigade 1st Armored Division, no questions asked either. So it wasn't a big deal. All I was going to say is it's what they issued me. In any case, well, they didn't really issue it to me, but no one ever complained, and most people said, where'd you get those straps? And I was like, those are pretty cool. And I really did like them, and they worked very well, and especially for my knife. As you can see, it actually straps on and goes, well, I'll show you here. The knife actually goes underneath my armpit, and it's held in the back. So it's easy enough to pull from here and put back in from here. And it's up above the waist, which means I don't have to worry about it getting wet and everything. And because it is upwards, it's standing upwards and easy to reach, I could get it out with no problem. And also, I didn't have to worry about it accidentally falling out. Because the typical thing what people were doing with their Mark II fighting knives is they would tape it upside down on their suspender, and then it would just fall out all the time. No problem with that. And you can see here, that's all I use, one of the clips that you use for your canteen to hold the knife in place. So it worked out really well for me. And with today's world of Mali and everything, you wouldn't need something like this, but we're talking about 40 years ago when attaching your gear was a whole lot different. Any case, that's the way I carried my Mark II fighting knife in the peacetime army in Bamberg, Germany, about 80 pounds ago. All you vets out there, are you familiar with how your doctor will go around telling you, man, you really need to lose weight. You're like 60 pounds overweight. Carrying all that extra weight around is hazardous to your health. Funny, the Army never said that about your rucksack. Carrying all that weight around is hazardous to your health. The spare tire I got around my waist probably weighs as much as my rucksack did back when I was in the Army. And I was never, ever told, don't carry that, it's bad for your health. Anyway, my Mark II fighting knife. And this is by Camillus. And I mentioned that my father gave it to me. I don't know if you can see there, but it does say U.S. Camillus there somewhere. I mentioned that my father gave this to me, and some people thought that when I said that, I was talking that my father gave his fighting knife to me, and that's not the case. This was a present to me that my father bought for me back in 1974 for a Christmas present. Knowing that I was going to eventually go into the Army, he wanted me to have a decent knife for the deal. And so that was the knife he bought for me. And at the time he said, this is the knife that he carried. By carried, the knife that he carried in World War II. Now, that was 1974 or so. I didn't know a lot about these knives at the time, other than that they were typically called a K-bar. I have learned quite a bit about them since then. And even before my father passed away, I knew quite a bit about these knives, as well as the Mark III trench knife, which was a knife that was issued to U.S. Army personnel in World War II. Now this is one by Ontario. It's a current production, well, not current production, it was made about 10 or 15 years ago. It is not a World War II issue M3 trench knife. First of all, Ontario did not make them in World War II, but I think this is probably the most accurate reproduction of an M3 trench knife in current use, let me put it that way. And it basically uses the same blade as the original M3 trench knife, because these blades are the same blades that were used on all the military bayonets from M4, M5, M6, M7. They all had the same blade as the M3 trench knife, and so that's why. So dimensional wise and everything else, 1095 carbon steel, everything about this knife is pretty much an excellent reproduction of an M3 trench knife from World War II. But this video is not really about that. It is about this knife, the Mark II fighting knife that my father gave me, and more about something my father told me when he gave this knife to me. The fact that he said this was the type of knife he carried in World War II. My father was in the U.S. Army Infantry, 3rd Infantry Division, serving in Italy. He was not a Marine, and he was not in the Navy. Now, after getting in the Army and reading up a lot about all sorts of stuff, several years passed. I run into my father around 1984 or so, and I asked him, are you sure this is the knife you carried in World War II? Because everything I read says that these knives were given to the Marines and the Navy. These were not given to Army personnel. And he goes, I don't care what you read. This is the knife I carried in World War II. This is the knife I carried in World War II, this style of knife. He carried a Mark II fighting knife. And he says, and I know very well what I was carrying because I was the one carrying it. And I said, but, all the books say that the Army was issued this knife. And he kind of laughed at me and chuckled and said, no, that's the knife that all the paratroopers got and all the officers got. The basic BAR man, he got whatever knife the Army was going to give him. And I didn't get one of those because I wasn't an officer and I wasn't a paratrooper. This is what I got. So he definitely knew what I was talking about when I said M3 trench knife, Mark II fighting knife. So I've always been wondering, if my father was correct, and I have no reason to doubt him, he was very much of sound mind. He even pointed out that this looked like the bayonet that they gave him for his M16 rifle when he was in Vietnam. This doesn't look like that. So he knew what he was talking about. Now, by the time he was in Vietnam, he was no longer in the Army. He was actually wounded at Anzio in World War II and discharged from the Army with disability. His arm was so screwed up that he couldn't use it. And then in 1947, he basically waived his disability, went back into the Army, and they could not put him in a combat arm unit. So he went to Cooks and Baker School, and while at Cooks and Baker School, his unit transferred from the United States Army to the United States Air Force. And so they asked him, do you want to continue wearing the green uniform, or do you want to go and buy a new blue uniform? And he said, I'll join the Air Force. And he put on a blue uniform and was in the Air Force until 1969, serving throughout the Korean War and also into Vietnam. He was only in Vietnam for a very short time, basically because of the Tet Offensive. He had been stationed in the Philippines and was sent to the Tet Offensive. When the Tet Offensive happened, he was sent to Vietnam to establish a mess hall in Saigon because of the enormous overflow of personnel into the area. So that's how he ended up in Vietnam, and I got issued an M16 with a bayonet. Otherwise, you would have probably never even seen an M16 as a cook in the Air Force. But in any case, beyond that point, it comes back to my question of how could a BAR gunner be issued a Mark II fighting knife in the Mediterranean theater of operation? He was in the Army. Now I could picture it if he was in the Philippines or something during World War II. Army personnel probably got a hold of these knives relatively easily. But my bet is it's exactly what he said. He got it through the supply sergeant, and they were going to give him whatever knife they had available. And I have a feeling that with it being the Mediterranean and the way the Army was going through personnel versus the way the Navy was going through personnel, I have a feeling that the Army was probably procuring USN Mark II utility knives and issuing them to Army personnel. That would be my thought of how my father, a private, a BAR gunner in the 3rd Infantry Division, would end up with a Mark II fighting knife. I bet anything that it was stamped USN, not USA or US Army, and not USMC, because from what I understand, there's a grand total of like 2 Marines at Anzio. Everything else was U.S. military personnel, and the Marines were there as an observer just to see, check on how they were doing amphibious landings. So if anyone out there knows anyone else who was in the U.S. Army serving in Europe, most likely in the Mediterranean, do you know of any other stories of U.S. Army personnel being issued a Mark II fighting knife? Also commonly referred to as a K-bar back then. I have a feeling they would have not been called a K-bar in the Mediterranean because there just wasn't that many Marines. So that was a name the Marines were calling these knives. And I also, but Camillus made the majority of these knives in World War II. And they also made the majority of the U.S., the majority of the Camillus-made knives went to the United States Navy, not to the Marine Corps. That's why you hear the Marine Corps say, I want a K-bar, more or less, because they didn't want the one that was stamped USN. They wanted one that was stamped USMC, and that would have been a K-bar, most likely. There were some USN K-bars, and there were also some Camillus-made knives for the United States Marine Corps, but the Camillus-made knives for the U.S. Marine Corps were not stamped USMC, from what I understand. They were just stamped Camillus. So, what do you think? I do believe my father when he says this is the knife that he was issued. My only thought is I speculate that it had to be a Navy knife that was procured by the Army simply because of shortages of material due to the heavier losses of Army personnel versus Navy personnel. Remember that the United States military was actually supplying equipment and weapons for not only the United States Army, but Commonwealth forces and the British Army serving in the Mediterranean theater. That's why most of the British forces fighting in the Mediterranean were using Thompson submachine guns versus thin guns. Any case, what do you guys think? I know this isn't the typical knife chat, but it is a chat, and it is about a knife. And I'll probably talk a little bit more about this knife in a future video.
And that's a wrap for another Fixed Blade Friday night. Thanks for dropping by. Don't forget to give us that thumbs up, leave a comment, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell. Really do appreciate you dropping by, and we'll be back again soon for another Fixed Blade Friday night.